let's kick this over. We're going to talk to Kevin Cloud. Kevin is a church planner. He is a pastor, and he is also author of the forthcoming book, God in Hamilton. Kevin, thanks for joining us on Live from the Path.
Yeah, it's so good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So I'm excited about this book, and so oddly enough, I was just scrolling Facebook one day, and then you had a sponsored ad out there for the book, for the Kickstarter, to help fund the book and the distribution of the book. And I was super excited for it. Hamilton, I've not seen, but I have heard, and there are just multiple elements that fascinate me and engage me. So I was super excited to see that you had kind of grabbed a hold of this and tied what I think are maybe more overt than what people recognize, spiritual themes within the musical, and helped to really kind of to bring it up to life. So let's start with what was your first interaction with the Hamilton musical? Was it seeing it? Was it hearing it? How did you first kind of run into it?
Yeah, so we kind of lucked out into some tickets in Broadway about 2.5 years ago. And so when we knew we were going to go see it, we actually started listening to it at home just to kind of prepare ourselves for it. And after seeing it live, I walked out of the theater knowing that it was a brilliant piece of art, obviously a brilliant musical, groundbreaking musical, everything everybody said about it.
Yep.
But I also walked out of the theater feeling like I had just experienced something that was deeply spiritual. These themes that you see played out in the story of grace and forgiveness and despair and surrender and redemption, it felt like it hit on all of the great themes of the spiritual life. And, there were moments where something would happen on stage in the theater, and it was almost like the entire atmosphere of the theater changed because something so profound had just happened, or something that revealed truth in a really powerful way happened, or maybe even, you could even use the language that somehow the Spirit of God was present and there and speaking to people who had ears to hear. And so I watched the musical and felt the sense of it being a deeply spiritual experience. And then I went home and I read the Chernow biography that the musical is built on. And, I knew nothing about Alexander Hamilton like most people before the show came out. And it was a deeply moving experience reading this book and reading about his life and his faith, and maybe even more so Eliza and her faith.
Yep.
I mean, both of these people were just deeply faithful people. They were not perfect, obviously, but Alexander, he comes to America and he goes to a college where he attends chapel twice a day. He prays. His roommate remarks about how moving and touching his prayers were. In his later years of his life, there's stories of his kids talking about him reading the scriptures to him and him wanting to build them a chapel on the land that he buys. On his deathbed, he invites 2 or 3 different priests and pastors to come and read him his last rites, and he confesses his dependence on the mercy of Christ. And I mean, there's just all these moments where you can tell this was a deeply spiritual man. And again, not a perfect man, a flawed man, but it's a spiritual story that musical is telling. And the other thing that made me think about writing this book is the more I heard other people talk about it, I heard people talking about it not only in terms of again, a brilliant musical, but as a life-changing experience. And it just made me think, man, what is happening in this play that people go and see that they would speak of it in that compelling of a term?
Right.
I heard a theater critic once say that it felt like a fresh wind was blowing through the theater as he watched Hamilton. And so again, I'm just hearing people use this language that I would attribute to a very spiritual reality, the presence of God in this story. And so I just wanted to write a book to help people kind of connect those dots and see the themes that I saw so deeply in this story.
So you had done an interview with Lauren Boyd, who is part of the show. Was that right?
Yeah, she's in the Broadway cast right now.
Okay, awesome. How did you hook up with her?
So when I started thinking about writing this book, I just started reaching out to a bunch of different Hamilton cast members.
Yeah.
And I either get on Instagram and direct message them, or I try to reach out through their agents. And actually probably had 5 or 10 that were intrigued and that at least were open to me sending the manuscript. But Lauren was probably out of everybody kind of the most enthusiastic about it. And she immediately was excited about reading it and wrote a really kind endorsement for the book. And we've done a podcast together and kind of gotten to know each other just a little bit through emailing and talking about the musical. And it's been really fun connecting with someone who's a part of the cast and who experiences this on the other side of the stage, obviously, than we do as the audience, but who can feel those same moments in the theater. At one point she said something to the effect of, when she's on stage, she feels those moments just as profoundly as the audience does when something significant happens in the story, and when some kind of a truth kind of comes to bear in the story. And so it's been really fun kind of getting to know her a little bit and hearing her perspective on the play. She told a really interesting story about a tradition that got started with Chris Jackson, who was the original George Washington on Broadway. And he's a spiritual man and a faithful man, and he would gather up the cast before every performance, and they would pray. They would pray for the show, they would pray for that evening, and they would pray that every single person that left the theater would be changed by that experience, whether they were on stage, whether they were in the orchestra pit, or whether they were the audience. And so they were praying, and that tradition, Lauren told me, continues to this day, where however many of the cast members are able to circle up and they pray and they ask that this show would change people's lives. And I think that's happening.
Well, that's great, and that's actually the part that stuck out as I was kind of reading through the transcript of the interview. Is kind of those moments of transcendence. Do you, when you were there watching, do you recall? You kind of, I think, spoke to this, but like, what specific part of the play or the moments that kind of felt that way for you?
Yeah, sure. There were a lot of them. Probably the most powerful ones. The song "Quiet Uptown." Yeah. Where they're struggling with the death of their son and the rebuilding of their marriage after Alexander has betrayed Eliza so deeply. And he betrays her in this affair, and then he makes the affair public in a pamphlet he writes, basically to try to save his own political career. So now he's basically betrayed her twice, right?
Yeah.
And so they're struggling with the rebuilding of their marriage. They are dealing with the loss of their son, and Alexander is asking for forgiveness. And it's really fascinating because in that song, Eliza is cold and distant, and at one point, Alexander reaches out and touches her arm, and she flinches. I mean, you can see the distance in her body language, but slowly she softens, and then at kind of towards the end of the song, she starts singing with him, and the whole chorus sings this line, "Forgiveness." Can you imagine? And oh my gosh, it is such a powerful moment. I mean, you hear people tell stories of weeping when that moment happens, when forgiveness is finally offered. Another moment for me that was really powerful is the very last song, where Eliza is singing about the orphanage that she builds.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea that this is actually the last chapter of my book. It's about redemption. And it's the idea that Alexander, who grew up as an orphan, this was the most broken part of his life, right? This was a wound that he carried with him his entire life. And Eliza, as his wife, I'm sure, carried that with him and carried that burden with him. And then she felt called by God. I mean, there's things that she has written where she felt a clear call by God to be a part of this group that started this orphanage. And to me, it's just a beautiful picture of how God takes the most broken parts of our lives and somehow makes them beautiful, right? Eliza takes this broken part of Alexander's life and then uses that as a way to redeem these other children who have a really bleak future and a bleak possibility in front of them. And she all of a sudden opens the door to a brand new, grace that they would have never been able to experience without that. And so as Eliza's singing about that, it's really amazing. And then the musical closes with her kind of looking up to heaven and catching a glimpse, I think, of her husband.
Yeah.
And it's just this really deeply moving moment of redemption, and maybe for me personally, one of the most powerful visual representation of redemption that I've ever seen.
I think that's it's Quiet Uptown is where I felt that, and again, having not seen it, but even just musically, and especially when you're driving, you got nothing else to do but kind of soak it in. And I would say that I had a similar moment of it was being impressed, but it was also like being impressed upon the clarity of understanding of feel. It's like you felt forgiveness right or well in a time where like people often have trouble articulating it or have trouble feeling it or even know what it is to kind of feel it right. And there was there's a clarity in that song that I think is very pure and very specific, and you just walk away with a piece if you're kind of engaged in it that I think is difficult to do and difficult to communicate. And I've definitely felt that in that song.
Well, and it's interesting. So Lin-Manuel Miranda talks about, he did an interview once, or maybe it was a speech he gave, where he talks about how one of his favorite aspects of live theater is its ability to create moments of action.
Yeah.
And what he means by that is that something happens on stage that confronts the audience and challenges the audience and forces the audience to ask the question, what am I going to do in response to this moment? And so you see this man who's betrayed his wife in the worst possible way, and you see her forgive him. And I think part of why it connects so deeply to the audience is every single one of us, either sitting in that theater or listening to it at home, either needs to forgive someone or needs to be forgiven by someone, certainly needs to be forgiven by God. And so it draws every single one of us in, and it confronts our lives, and it makes us ask the question, will we learn from Eliza's example? Will we follow the example she sets of forgiving someone who hurt her so deeply? And yet Eliza walked with God. And I like to imagine Eliza praying and begging God to give her the ability to forgive her husband, and knowing that God was calling her to forgive, and wrestling through that process and knowing it wouldn't be easy. But she did it. She forgave him, and they, lived the rest of their lives together.
So this is you can still pick this up if you guys that are listening. That you can get it on the Kickstarter. We got 3 more days. The launch of the book is the official release is June 7th, right? And then you can do
right. June 7th is the drop date.
Okay, yeah, June 7th is the drop date. You can still get it on the Kickstarter. You're funded though, right? Like I think I saw it a week ago, and you had already made your funding goal.
Yeah, I've already hit the goal, which is really exciting. But anything I raise on top of that just helps me, get to launch this book out into the world with a little bit more resources behind it. So I'm a first-time author and trying to get all the help I can get, and I have some advanced copies that I'm trying to get out into the world. So it's available on the Kickstarter. It's also, after 3 days is up, you can pre-order it anytime, but it'll be officially released on June 7th on Amazon.
That's exciting. So what type of stuff is out there on the Kickstarter? Yeah, I assume you can get a copy of the book. Anything else exciting?
Yeah. So the fun thing, the fun thing about the Kickstarter is that you're selling the book obviously, but you have all kinds of bonus material that you have. So I have a 30-day God and Hamilton devotional guide.
Sweet.
That I'm giving away at a certain level. Another thing I'm really excited about, I have some friends who are really talented musicians, and we went into the studio and we recorded a song. Alexander Hamilton wrote a hymn called "The Soul Ascending into Bliss." And so we actually wrote a hymn using his lyrics and then kind of writing a song to it. So that song is available on the Kickstarter as well.
Cool.
There's actually even 2 tickets in Des Moines that are available at a certain level of giving. If someone wants to try to grab a couple tickets in Des Moines, those are still up there. And then also there's an exclusive podcast with Lauren Boyd, who is we already mentioned her, but she's on the Hamilton cast. So there's all kinds of exclusive bonus giveaway stuff on top of the books as well that you can get there.
Yeah, very cool. Hey, you might as well get in on that. Here's the thing. Actually, I was slated to go with my daughter and my niece, and I'm going to be out of the country. My brother and I are going to Ethiopia, so I'm going to miss it. Him and I both are going to miss it, and so I'm super disappointed in that. I mean, it's the right reason to miss it, but in general, I'm still disappointed.
Yeah, that's a bad timing.
It's have you seen it? It's coming. Has it been in Kansas City? Why do I think it was Kansas City either recently or coming around? Have you been back to see
City's, it? No, I haven't. I saw it in New York, and then it's coming to Kansas City in June of 2019. So basically a year from now.
Okay.
Or a little more than a year is when it's come to Kansas City. So.
Gotcha. So one of the things actually that I was thinking about when you were discussing it earlier about the musical in relation to Alexander's faith is it does kind of give the impression that he moves into a more generic faith. Actually, this is just the impression that I get. He's talking about gods as opposed to a god, and there's I guess the musical at least gave me the impression that there's a lull in his life, kind of when the main primary action is happening, until the point of which he has that he has the affair, and then kind of finds out on the other side and starts praying again. Is that the wrong impression, or do you feel like that's actually what happened in his life?
No, I think that's actually pretty accurate, and it's interesting as I've gotten to know some people in the the Hamilton historical community. There's kind of differing opinions on this, and in some ways you never really know someone's personal faith and personal life with God. But but what you read in Chernon, what a lot of people also would concur with would be the idea that as a young man, or certainly as a boy and as a young man, he lived a pretty devout life of faith and lived pretty intimately connected to God, but kind of wandered in his middle age years, and faith didn't become as important to him. I mean, certainly as he's married to Eliza, she's attending church without him. She has a pew that they've rented in Trinity Church, but he doesn't really attend as religiously as she does. And so he kind of goes through almost a prodigal son season, it appears. But then towards the later years of his life, he seems to return to it with really full fervor. And again, we have stories of him reading the scriptures to his children, or him taking notes in the margins of his Bible. And again, his deathbed scene is, Chernow basically says, if you know anything about the scene of his deathbed, there's no doubt about this man's authentic flowering faith at the end of his life, and really for the last year or so, however long that lasted. So it's kind of an interesting development that he had, of very devout as a youth, kind of fell away from it, it appears, during some of the middle age years, and then came back to it very strongly towards the end.
And I think that that follows well, I guess, even with the tenor of the music. It makes sense, right? Like, and you get a kind of a glimpse of your own frailty, your own humanity, and how it starts to. You're trying to change the world under your own initiative, and then once you start to get at least some sense of perspective on your own life, and relative to things you can or cannot control, or the depths of which you can hurt someone, you start looking broader and outside of yourself. And
with Hamilton too, you're dealing with obviously going through the Revolutionary War, and the horrors that was involved in, and it's not hard to imagine someone kind of losing his faith. Seeing what he saw and going through what he went through, and again, a lot of this is conjecture, but you're right. I mean, that's a season of life that you kind of come up against your own limitations, and you start asking some questions, and you try to start figuring out what you believe and what you don't believe, and certainly that's a lot of people's stories. And I do think that part of why Hamilton's character connects so deeply with people is that he is a flawed character, right? I mean, he has these huge triumphs, but also these huge failures. And in another book you should totally check out is called Hamilton the Revolution, which is kind of the behind the scenes story of the play and interviews with all the actors. And it's a brilliant book. So you should definitely check that one out as well. But in that, they talk about a conversation that the actors were having about Hamilton and asking, was he too flawed of a character? Yeah. And they kind of decided that no, that actually draws the audience in, and that helps the audience say, hey, this person is a lot like me, and he's a lot like my life. My life is flawed. I love God, and I want to follow him, and yet I have failures and brokenness and flaws in my life as well. And that kind of a character actually draws people in and helps them engage deeply with the story.
And that's true, though. It would be very difficult to tell a similarly engaging story using if you want to think of any of the founding fathers, they're just they're a little bit too etched in stone. Like that wasn't their reality, right? I think we know that their lives were certainly more complicated than that. But Hamilton's is so obvious that like it's something you feel like you can actually be invited into, and so there feels like a greater humanity there. I think than some of the other founding fathers, to be able to tell this type of story and to engage in it in the way kind of the multi-ethnic cast and the ability to kind of tell the variants of the stories that are going on. Even Washington in the play kind of sits above, it sits above everything. That's just the way his character feels. I think it would be hard to tell that story through someone else's eyes that didn't have kind of the limitations or frailties, I guess, that Alexander Hamilton had or demonstrated.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I also think that another reason that it's been so powerful is that nobody knows anything about his story.
Right.
And so it's a fresh story. Nobody knows what happens. No, it's a surprise to everyone. I mean, obviously, you start listening to the music and you kind of pick it up, but before this musical came out, I mean, who knew Alexander Hamilton and his story, right? I mean, we were about to take him off the $10 bill,
right?
Because nobody really cared anymore.
Yep.
And then this musical comes out, and all of a sudden, U.S. Secretary of Treasury decisions are being changed because of the popularity now of this guy's story. But I do think that helped it as well, was the fact that he was such an unknown founding father. And so it's kind of a fresh story for a lot of people.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Hey, we've been hanging out. We're talking with Kevin Cloud, and you can still pick this up. We said, look, you can get it on the Kickstarter. There's lots of cool stuff going on. 2 tickets still open in Des Moines to be able to pick up at a certain level. Go check that out. And if you just, I didn't get the URL. Just do a Google search for Kickstarter and God in Hamilton. You'll find it be the first result, and you can pick that up. You can also go to godinhamilton.com. There's information sitting out there, that interview or excerpts from that interview that I was asking about earlier sitting out there. Copies of some of the hymn or the poetry that's out there. Is that the one that makes up the hymn that you had recorded?
Yeah, that's so the hymn that we recorded is called "The Soul Ascending to Bliss," and that's a song that we wrote. And yeah, that'll be on the Kickstarter page as well for people that buy the.
Oh yeah. And you can go check out if you want to look at the words of that. If you go to godinhamilton.com, up on the blog, there's it shows what the words are, so you can kind of dig on that before you get exposure to the tune there. And like I said, if nothing else, it's launching June 7th, and you can do the pre-order anywhere, anytime prior to that, and go and pick it up. Kevin, thank you so much for hanging out with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Kevin. Bye.